Hello and welcome to our first Friday FinTech Features updates from the week and insights into the financial market, hosted by DX Compliance Solutions. I'm Karen, I'm sitting here with Simon.
Yep, we're hoping to invite a good series of guests coming up in the near future, so it'll be different people each week, different topics, and always something relevant that's happening in the space.
Yeah, and today we found an interesting article about Facebook hiring a British bank lobbyist ahead to their cryptocurrency launch. Simon, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting move. So Facebook and the whole Facebook cryptocurrency issue has been on my mind quite a lot recently, I would say. And both from a compliance perspective, but also from a market perspective, it's obviously a really smart move now to hire somebody who's going to lobby in their favor for a better relationship, I would say, with the public authorities and also other companies. Yeah, definitely.
It's still a controversial topic. Do you think we should be worried about that?
Yeah, it's definitely controversial. So I think, anyone who's aware of the space, anyone who's been involved in it is going to be aware of that. And I think if you're involved or in any way worried about sort of data and anything like this, then it's especially from a European perspective, something where people are very, very quick to be scared of somehow having their finances in any way attached to a company that knows so much about them, so to say. It's quite a big mental crossover, if you want to put it that way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, traditionally banks were a trusted institution.
Yeah.
And we've seen it. Obviously, we've seen a huge amount of change there in the entire fintech space, banking crisis, and so on and so forth. But to make that transition into social media company, holding a lot of your personal data about your sort of the intimate aspects of your life, if you want, and crossing over into the place which is responsible for looking after potentially large amounts of your assets, it's quite a big leap to make. But I don't necessarily think it's something you need to worry about. I think it's really a process that needs to be understood, and how do we go through this?
Oh, wouldn't you say that financial institutions already had all the data? Because I mean, if they know what you're paying with your credit card, they already have your data and they know what you're doing. So actually, I don't think it's that different to social media, because they know kind of the same.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would argue that if you were to follow my credit card pattern, you'd actually be able to see basically my daily route. You'd be able to find me probably at any given time of day within probably a 10-minute window. If you knew what you were doing and knew how to find you, you'd find me on the street. It'd be quite possible. However, I think what worries people is not so much the reality of what's happening. It's just that it's simply that mental process that they need to go through, that kind of psychological process of bridging what for them often conceptually are two very, very different business worlds. So that's something which needs to be addressed, and needs to be addressed relevantly. And it's of course something that the regulator in a whole wide range of countries is really interested in doing so. So I think having a lobbyist which understands that process is going to be useful, for sure.
Would you say that people would be differently concerned, like regarding the age group, because like younger people are more into social media than probably older people are?
Definitely. So I think there's two aspects of that. So on the one side, obviously, you have an entire generation which has grown up with social media and knows absolutely nothing different. You understand, and they understand themselves, various risks attached to that. They're more aware, I would say, than people realize of the risks, but they deal with them in a very, very different way. And because they have really grown up surrounded by those risks, it's something they have quite, let's say, internalized, which is something very different to your process that you go through as an adult who gets introduced to technology at a later stage in your life and then becomes usually aware afterwards of the various risks, and then something new comes up and you start to sort of assess the risks again. It's sort of a never-ending process, which makes you slightly more worried to this change. What I do think though, and that kind of really links into both aspects, so about the age groups and the approach to it, is if we're talking, whether we're talking about Facebook or whether we're talking about fintech in general, the products that we create, that's something which is by its very nature going to be defined by future generations. That's not to say, of course, that we're not going to have amazing products for older people and for elderly groups of people, not at all. But I think really, as with any market, if you want to future-proof yourself, you have to concentrate on what that future market wants. You know, what do they want, and how do they react? How do they work in their financial life? Because you probably spend money differently to your parents would spend money.
Yeah.
I'm assuming.
So. Yeah.
As I do to mine, and definitely to my grandparents, for example, who have a very, very different financial behaviour to myself and to our peers. So yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Thanks. Like regarding the regulators, how do you think they would going to approach this whole aspect with the Facebook cryptocurrency?
Yeah, so much like countries, regulators and regulatory authorities often have, let's say, culture attached to them. And you can often see that there are regulators who are more willing to work with companies and regulators who tend to be much more resistant. They don't have any kind of open innovation sandboxes, no public-private cooperation schemes, and so on and so forth. And so it's those kind of authorities which tend to take a lot longer to adapt and to allow companies somehow a bit of, let's say, free room within the market. And you have, I guess, like we were talking about it this morning, but if you take the FCA and the German BaFin. So these two are perfect examples in their approach towards consumer protection. The consumer protection legislation is not just completely different in both countries because of the way the law has developed. The entire cultural approach is completely different. So in one of these countries, in one of these jurisdictions, you are quite likely, without ever having a customer complain that you've done something wrong, to find yourself in breach of a piece of consumer protection regulation and be liable to pay a fine. In the other, it's very, very unlikely to happen unless there is a civil suit being brought against you by that individual customer, and it definitely won't be a class action suit. So it's, very, very different approaches. And I think when you transpose this into this kind of thing, you're then not just talking about financial regulation, you're talking about data protection regulation, which of course, as soon as you hear Facebook, is one of the major issues going through people's minds in this area. And those are, even just within Europe, which is tiny geographically compared to the rest of the globe, are so different culturally, sort of our approach and expectations towards these things, that it's something that really needs to be thought about. What I do think though is that what regulators really need to be aware of is, of course, it's their duty to ensure the stability of the financial market, to protect consumers' interests, to protect against sort of any form of unfair market advantage and so on and so forth. But as we just mentioned, the entire future of fintech, of any market, is defined by the future of what the consumers in that market want. So the regulator and regulators, plural, will need to find a way of really understanding the patterns and the future of that market, the way that it's supposed to develop and the way that the people want it to develop, and then finding a way of really mitigating the risk out of that. So it's really, we have especially in anti-money laundering compliance, we have a so-called risk-based approach, and it's really about understanding the risk on a market-wide macroeconomic scale, and then also on more individual processes, and trying to find something that's suitable and works in the best interests of the consumer and allows them to have something which they get the best out of. Yeah. I think that's probably the easiest way to explain it.
Okay, great, thank you. Any last thoughts on that topic?
No, I think Facebook, when they push this forward, are in for an interesting journey. I think it's going to be very interesting times inside the teams working for this. I've seen it myself, and I think, as you know, I'm always preaching that people should consider setting up their processes and structures really early to make the entire thing as scalable as possible and to basically try and control any potential damage in the future. So I can only recommend that they stress test everything they possibly can and really, really pull each process to pieces and put it safely in place before doing it, because that is definitely one danger for Facebook. If they get this wrong, it will be remembered as the thing that went wrong because they are so well known, because it's such a household name. So
that's right.
Rather do it properly the first time round and really push for the best. Yeah.
Nice. Perfect. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week for our FinTech Friday features.
Yeah, thanks very much. We're excited to be doing this and hope to bring you some really interesting guests and pieces over the coming weeks.